Ever get that, like, rush when you finally figure out how to land that combo in your favorite game? Or maybe the little fist pump moment when you finally understand a tricky concept in class?
Yeah,
And who
absolutely.
hasn't felt a sudden shift in mood, like going from excited to a bit down for seemingly no reason? Well, believe it or not, those moments, the wins, the understanding, even the mood swings, often have a key player behind the scenes, a fascinating molecule called dopamine.
Exactly. Welcome to this deep dive into dopamine. We've gathered a range of scientific information, from broad explanations to specific research, to really get under the hood of what this chemical is all about.
Right. So our mission today is to make the science of dopamine clear and, engaging for you. We're going to explore what it does in your body, especially your brain, and why it's so crucial for everything from learning new skills for that driver's test to understanding why you feel certain ways.
Hmm.
We're kind of cutting through the complex stuff to bring you the cool, surprising facts that make dopamine such a vital and talked about molecule.
And the sources we've looked at give us a really comprehensive picture. We'll be covering dopamine's basic structure, how your body makes and breaks it down, its many jobs in the brain, think motivation to achieve your goals, the satisfaction of rewards, and how your body coordinates movement, and
Right.
even its roles outside the brain. We'll also touch on what happens when dopamine systems aren't working as they should, and even find out it's in some surprising places, like the plant kingdom.
Okay, let's unpack this from the beginning then. What exactly is dopamine? We hear the term thrown around a lot, but what is it, like, fundamentally?
Well, it's fascinating because dopamine acts in two important ways. It's both a hormone and a neurotransmitter.
Okay.
Think of hormones as messengers that travel throughout the bloodstream to have effects on different parts of the body.
Hmm.
Neurotransmitters, on the other hand, are more like local, fast-acting messengers that nerve cells use to communicate directly with each other in the brain and nervous system.
So it's like a text message between friends versus a school-wide announcement. Is that kind of right?
That's a great way to put it, yeah. Chemically, dopamine belongs to a couple of families called catecholamines and phenethylamines. These are groups of organic compounds that share similar basic structure.
Mm.
What's really interesting is that even though it's a relatively small and simple molecule, it can have these really widespread and significant effects in the body and brain.
Simple but powerful. Okay. Where does this powerful little molecule actually come from? How is it made?
It's synthesized in your body from amino acids that you get from the food you eat, specifically phenylalanine and tyrosine, which are found in things like dairy, meats, and nuts. There are a couple of steps in the process, but the main pathway involves phenylalanine being converted into tyrosine, then into something called LDOPA, and finally into dopamine.
LDOPA. I think I've heard that name before, maybe in the context of a medical condition.
That's right. Yeah, we'll touch on that later when we talk about what happens when dopamine systems don't work correctly. But for now, the key thing to understand is that while dopamine is present in some foods, the dopamine circulating in your body can't directly enter your brain because of something called the blood-brain barrier. It's
Oh.
like a security system for your brain. So the dopamine that's doing its job in your brain has to be manufactured right there.
Okay, so dopamine is made in the brain and acts as a messenger between brain cells. How does that communication actually happen? What's its main role, in our heads?
Well, dopamine's work in the brain relies on a pretty sophisticated system of storage, release, and reuptake. Inside neurons, dopamine molecules are stored in tiny little sacs called vesicles.
Vesicles, right.
When a nerve signal arrives at the end of a neuron, these vesicles fuse with the neuron's outer membrane and release dopamine into the synapse. That's the really tiny gap between two neurons.
So it's like launching a message across a small gap to the next brain cell.
Precisely. Once the dopamine is released, it floats across the synapse and binds to specific proteins on the receiving neuron called receptors. Think of a receptor as a lock and dopamine as a key.
Okay.
What's particularly interesting is that there aren't just one type of lock, but 5 main types of dopamine receptors labeled D1 through D5.
5 different locks for the same key. Huh. What difference does that make?
Well, each of these 5 receptor types can trigger a different response in the receiving neuron. Some are excitatory, meaning they make the neuron more likely to send its own signal, while others are inhibitory, meaning they make it less likely to fire.
Okay.
This complexity allows dopamine to fine-tune its effects across different brain regions, and in different situations, it's not just a simple on-off switch.
That makes sense, like having different settings on a remote control or something. So where are these dopamine messages being sent in the brain, and what kind of information are they carrying?
There are several key dopamine pathways in the brain, and each one plays a crucial role in different functions. One of the most well-known is the reward pathway, also called the mesolimbic pathway.
Right, the reward pathway.
It starts in an area called the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, and connects to another area called the nucleus accumbens. This pathway is absolutely fundamental for motivation and the feeling of reward.
Reward. So this is where those good feelings come from, like the satisfaction after finishing a challenging puzzle or the excitement of getting a good grade.
Exactly. Well, actually, the anticipation of something good causes an increase in dopamine activity in this pathway. So the core takeaway here is dopamine spikes when you expect something good, driving you to go for it.
Oh, interesting. So it's the wanting.
Yeah, it's the engine of motivation. Think about when you're looking forward to hanging out with friends after school or finally getting that new video game. Dopamine is playing a big role in that feeling of anticipation and desire.
Got it. So reward and motivation are key for this pathway. What other important pathways involve dopamine?
Another major one is the motor control pathway, or nigrostriatal pathway. This runs from a brain region called the substantia nigra to an area called the dorsal striatum.
Okay.
Dopamine in this pathway is essential for coordinating your movements and learning new motor skills. That feeling of finally getting the hang of parallel parking.
Yeah, I remember that struggle.
Dopamine hard at work in that motor control pathway. Research has really highlighted how dopamine helps your brain learn and refine those physical actions.
That totally makes sense. So when I was first learning to ride a bike, dopamine was helping my brain figure out the balance and pedaling and all that.
Precisely. And there are other important dopamine pathways too. There's the mesocortical pathway, which goes from the VTA to the prefrontal cortex, the front part of your brain involved in things like planning, decision-making, and focusing your attention.
The executive function.
Right. And then there's the tuberoinfundibular pathway, which connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland and helps regulate the release of certain hormones like prolactin.
Wow, so dopamine's involved in way more than just feeling good and moving around. Speaking of feeling good, a lot of people think dopamine is the direct source of pleasure. Is that really the case?
That's a very common idea. And while dopamine definitely plays a role in how we experience things, the current scientific understanding is a bit more nuanced. It's more accurate to say that dopamine is crucial for what we call motivational salience.
Motivational salience. Okay, let's break that down. Sounds fancy.
Think of it this way. Dopamine highlights how important or desirable or even undesirable something is. It's like your brain's way of saying, pay attention to this. This could be really good for you or really bad.
Okay.
This signal then drives you to either seek it out, wanting, or avoid it, avoiding.
So it's more about the intense desire for something rather than just the pure enjoyment of having it, like the craving for pizza even before you take the first bite.
Exactly. That intense desire that I really want this feeling is driven by dopamine highlighting the salience or importance of that pizza. And this leads us to the fascinating idea of reward prediction error.
Reward prediction error.
Yeah. Your dopamine neurons fire most strongly when you experience a reward that you didn't expect. If you expect a reward and you get it, the dopamine response is much weaker. And if you expect a reward and don't get it, dopamine levels actually dip below your normal baseline.
That's mind-blowing, seriously. So our brains are constantly predicting and adjusting based on these dopamine signals. That must be super important for how we learn from our experiences.
Absolutely. This prediction error signal is fundamental for learning because it helps us update our expectations and adjust our behaviors based on what happened before. And while dopamine isn't solely responsible for the feeling of pleasure itself, it is certainly involved in some aspects of it. For example, research has shown dopamine release during enjoyable activities like playing video games, which, as the studies suggest, is linked to learning the game mechanics and the feeling of accomplishment as you progress.
Okay.
However, it's important to remember that there are other pleasure centers in the brain that operate independently of the dopamine system.
Okay, so dopamine is the wanting chemical with some influence on liking, and it's constantly helping us learn through prediction. That's a really helpful way to think about it. Now, we focus a lot on the brain, but you mentioned earlier that dopamine has jobs outside the central nervous system, too. Tell me more about that. It sounds surprising.
It is quite surprising. Yes, dopamine also functions as a local messenger in various parts of the body outside the brain and spinal cord. For instance, in blood vessels, it can help them relax and widen, acting as a vasodilator. And it can also inhibit the release of norepinephrine, another important signaling molecule.
So it helps regulate blood flow in different areas. Interesting.
Exactly. In the kidneys, dopamine plays a role in increasing the excretion of sodium and water in urine. In the pancreas, it helps to regulate the production of insulin.
Wow.
It even has effects in the digestive system, where it can influence the movement of food through the gut and help protect the lining of the intestines. And interestingly, in the immune system, dopamine can actually reduce the activity of certain immune cells called lymphocytes. So this tiny molecule is doing all sorts of things outside the brain that we don't even consciously realize.
That's a really wide range of functions.
Yeah.
Is the dopamine in these different parts of the body coming from the brain? Or?
For the most part, no. With the exception of some potential influence on blood vessels in specific circumstances, the dopamine in these peripheral systems is usually synthesized locally, right where it's needed, and it exerts its effects right there, near the cells that release it. Remember, dopamine itself has difficulty crossing that protective blood-brain barrier.
Right. So it's like the brain has its own internal dopamine communication network, and then there are separate local dopamine networks operating in other parts of the body for different tasks.
That's a good way to think about it. Now, what happens when these dopamine systems, either in the brain or elsewhere, don't work correctly? It sounds like that could lead to some significant health issues.
Definitely. Let's start with a condition that many people have heard of, Parkinson's disease.
Parkinson's is a neurodegenerative disorder that primarily affects movement. It's caused by the progressive loss of dopamine-producing neurons in a specific area of the midbrain called the substantia nigra.
The substantia nigra, okay.
This loss of dopamine leads to the characteristic symptoms of Parkinson's, such as tremors, stiffness, slow movement, and problems with balance.
And that's why L-DOPA is used as a treatment, right? Because it can get into the brain and be converted into dopamine to help compensate for the loss.
Exactly. Since dopamine itself can't cross the blood-brain barrier effectively, giving the precursor, L-DOPA, allows the remaining neurons in the brain to produce more dopamine. It's often given in combination with other medications that help prevent L-DOPA from being broken down before it reaches the brain.
Okay, that makes sense. What about drug addiction? I know dopamine is often strongly linked to the development of addiction. How does that work?
Yeah, many addictive drugs, particularly psychostimulants like cocaine and amphetamines, exert their effects by dramatically increasing dopamine levels in the brain, especially within that reward pathway we talked about earlier.
Right, the mesolimbic one.
Cocaine works by blocking the reuptake of dopamine from the synapse, meaning it stays there longer and has a more prolonged and intense effect on the receiving neurons. Amphetamines, on the other hand, can both increase the release of dopamine and block its reuptake.
So like a double whammy.
Pretty much. This massive surge of dopamine contributes to the intense feelings of pleasure and the strong reinforcement that drives the cycle of addiction. It's interesting to note that with stimulant withdrawal, the symptoms are often more psychological in nature, such as intense cravings and irritability, rather than the severe physical withdrawal symptoms associated with some other types of drugs.
Right, I've heard about that difference. And what about mental health conditions like psychosis? Is there a dopamine link there?
Yes. The dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia suggests that an overactivity of dopamine systems in certain brain regions may contribute to the development of psychotic symptoms, like hallucinations and delusions.
Okay.
Many antipsychotic medications that are used to treat these conditions work by blocking dopamine receptors, thereby reducing the overall activity of dopamine in the brain.
And ADHD. I know stimulant medications are frequently used to treat that as well, which seems kind of counterintuitive sometimes.
It does, doesn't it? But yes, altered dopamine neurotransmission is also implicated in attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, which affects attention, impulse control, and activity levels. Surprisingly, stimulant medications like methylphenidate and amphetamine, which are used to treat ADHD, actually work by increasing the levels of both dopamine and norepinephrine in the prefrontal cortex.
The part for planning and focus.
Exactly. This increase helps to improve focus and reduce impulsivity in individuals with ADHD. It's believed to help optimize dopamine levels in those key brain areas, sort of bringing them into a better balance.
It's amazing how one molecule can be implicated in such a diverse range of conditions, from movement disorders to addiction to mental health. You also briefly mentioned dopamine's involvement in pain and nausea earlier.
That's right. Dopamine plays a role in how we process pain signals within the central nervous system. Reduced dopamine levels have even been linked to the chronic pain that is often experienced by individuals with Parkinson's disease.
Interesting.
And when it comes to nausea and vomiting, there's a specific area in the brainstem called the chemoreceptor trigger zone that has a high concentration of dopamine D2 receptors. Drugs that activate these receptors can trigger nausea, while drugs that block them are often effective in treating nausea and vomiting.
Wow, so dopamine is this incredibly fundamental chemical player that influences so many different aspects of our bodily functions and mental states. It's almost hard to believe it's found in other kingdoms of life, too. You mentioned plants. That was a real surprise.
It is quite remarkable, isn't it? Dopamine has indeed been found in many different types of plants, and sometimes in quite significant amounts. Bananas, especially in the peel and the pulp of red and yellow varieties, contain relatively high concentrations.
Bananas? No way.
Yeah. Potatoes, avocados, broccoli, and Brussels sprouts also contain measurable levels of dopamine. So that banana you ate this morning did have dopamine in it.
That's wild. But why would plants have dopamine? Do we have any idea what it does for them? Are bananas secretly happy or something?
Well, while we can't say for sure if bananas experience happiness, researchers are investigating the roles of dopamine in plants. There's evidence suggesting that in plants, dopamine might be involved in responding to various types of stress, such as infections caused by bacteria or fungi.
Okay.
It may also play a role in regulating growth and development in certain situations, and even influence how sugars are metabolized within the plant. Interestingly, plants synthesize dopamine from tyrosine using biochemical pathways that are quite similar to those found in animals.
That's incredible. Same basic machinery at work in such different life forms. You also mentioned dopamine being a precursor to melanin, the pigment that gives us our skin and hair color. How does that work?
Yes, dopamine is a precursor molecule in the synthesis of melanin in some organisms. This includes potentially in plants, contributing to browning reactions, like when fruit goes brown, and also in the formation of the intricate patterns and colors we see on these like butterfly wings and the stripes on some insect larvae. Nature is truly amazing in how it reuses and adapts fundamental molecules for so many different purposes.
Absolutely. We've covered so much about what dopamine does, where it comes from, and what happens when things go wrong. Let's take a quick look back at the history of its discovery. When did scientists first actually identify dopamine?
Well, dopamine was first chemically synthesized in a laboratory way back in 1910.
Oh, okay, 1910.
But its crucial role as a neurotransmitter in the brain wasn't fully recognized until 1958, thanks to the pioneering work of two Swedish scientists, Arvid Carlsson and Nils O'Killarp.
1958, so much later.
Yeah, Carlsson was later awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in the year 2000 for this groundbreaking discovery. It demonstrated that dopamine wasn't just an intermediate step in the production of other neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and epinephrine, but was itself a vital chemical messenger in the brain. So, before 1958, scientists didn't even realize dopamine had its own important and distinct role. There was a huge revelation.
That really is huge. And you also mentioned something about polydopamine that sounds like a very modern application of this knowledge. What's that about?
Yes, that's a really fascinating and more recent development. Researchers have discovered that dopamine molecules have the ability to self-polymerize.
Polymerize, like linked together.
Exactly. They can link together spontaneously to form thin film coatings on various surfaces. These polydopamine coatings have some incredibly useful properties, particularly in the field of biomedical science.
Like what?
For example, they can be applied to everything from nanoparticles used in drug delivery to the surfaces of medical implants to improve their biocompatibility and prevent rejection. They're even being explored for use in creating adhesive layers for biosensors. It's a great illustration of how our fundamental understanding of a molecule like dopamine can lead to really innovative and practical applications.
Wow, from brain messenger to high-tech coatings, that's quite a journey. This has been an incredibly deep dive into the world of dopamine. So for you, our listener, what would you say are the most important things to take away from our discussion today?
Well, I think the key points are that dopamine is a fundamental chemical messenger in your body, acting as both a hormone and a crucial neurotransmitter in the brain. It plays essential roles in driving your motivation, the feeling of reward when you achieve something, learning new things, and coordinating your movements.
Right.
It also has significant influences on your mood and various functions throughout your body, even outside the brain. And importantly, while it's often linked to pleasure, its role in generating that feeling of wanting and in helping your brain learn from unexpected outcomes, that reward prediction error thing, is really central to understanding how it affects your behavior and daily experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And for our listeners who are around 18, think about how dopamine is at play in so many of your everyday experiences, from the satisfaction of mastering a new skill in a game or in sports, to the excitement of social interactions, to the drive to achieve your goals in school or your personal life. It's all connected to this amazing and versatile molecule working behind the scenes.
So here's maybe a final thought for you to consider. Given the incredibly wide-ranging effects of dopamine, how might a deeper understanding of this molecule empower you to better understand your own motivations, your responses to rewards and disappointments, and even your learning processes?
That's a good question.
Think about those times you really wanted something, or felt a rush of excitement, or even struggled with motivation. How might dopamine have been involved? And with ongoing research continuing to uncover the complexities of dopamine, what future breakthroughs do you think are most likely or exciting in areas like understanding and treating mental health conditions, enhancing learning abilities, or even tackling addiction? Lots to think about.